Your child will have a home, the cold ranchers said, but you must warm my bed tonight. The cavernous ranch house was a place of hollow loneliness, cold, undisputed power, and the bitter tang of regret. From behind a glass of amber whiskey, Caleb Thorne watched the woman, Lydia Monroe. He knew a grubline rider's desperation when he saw it, a pride worn thin by hunger. His unyielding gaze sized her up a wolf assessing a cornered doe. But it was the child small and shivering beside her that cracked the iron mask of his composure. For a fleeting second he saw a ghost, another little girl, another pair of frightened eyes frozen in a memory of blood and fire. He swirled the liquor, the ice clinking like a funeral bell. He had a solution for her desperation, an offer forged in his own private hell. She was about to beg for a home for her daughter, but what he would demand in return would cost far more than her pride. It would cost her very soul. He let the silence hang in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket meant to smother the last embers of her defiance. The fire spit casting dancing demons on the rough-hewn walls of the great room, a space built for a family that no longer existed. He could see the fight in her eyes, a flicker of the same grit that had carried her across unforgiving territory to his doorstep. It was almost a shame to extinguish it. Almost. "I have no work for a woman's hands," he said, his voice a low gravel as cold as the wind whipping through Redemption Gulch. He watched her shoulders slump, the last sliver of hope draining from her face. He let her feel the full weight of that finality before he delivered the killing blow. "But the nights here are cold." He leaned forward, the worn leather of his armchair groaning in protest. "And my bed is empty." The horror flashed in her eyes, a brief, wild storm, before she shuddered it away behind a mask of disbelief. He saw her mind racing, searching for another meaning, another escape. There was none. He had built this cage of words with brutal precision. "Sir, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh, I think you do." Caleb countered his tone, leaving no room for misunderstanding. He stood a towering shadow against the firelight and walked to the hearth. He did not look at her, instead staring into the flames as if they held the answers to a question he'd long forgotten. "Your girl needs a roof over her head. She needs medicine, a warm fire food in her belly. This I can provide. This I will provide." He turned his eyes, locking onto hers. They were blue, he noticed. A stormy, defiant blue. "In return, you will provide companionship. You will warm my bed, and you will ask for nothing more. No promises, no sentiment. It is a simple arrangement, a trade. Shelter for submission." Lydia's hand flew to her daughter's shoulder, a protective, instinctual gesture. The little girl rose, coughed, then a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the vast, silent room. It was the sound of a closing trap. He watched the war play out across the pale landscape of her face. He saw the revulsion, the shame, the fierce, burning pride of a woman brought to her knees. And then he saw it all burn away, consumed by the all-powerful terror of a mother's love. Her gaze fell to the child. The war was over. He had won. She will be safe. Lydia's voice was barely a breath stripped of all its earlier fire. All that remained were ashes. "She will want for nothing." Caleb confirmed his own voice hollow. Lydia Monroe took a ragged breath and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The deal was struck. A soul for a shelter. And Caleb Thorne, for the first time in years, felt nothing like a victor. A bitter taste like ash rose in his throat. He turned back to the whiskey, needing its fire to burn away the sudden chill that had settled deep in his bones. "Martha will show you to your rooms," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a darkened hallway. An old, stern-faced woman emerged from the shadows as if summoned. "The child will have the room adjacent. See that she gets a hot meal and a bath." His words were curt commands, the terms of a contract being executed. He did not want to look at them anymore. He could not bear to see what he had just bought at so steep a price. He listened to their faint footsteps recede down the hall, the sound swallowed by the immense hungry silence of the house. He was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. It was alive with the ghost he'd just invited in, alive with the breathing of a child in a room that had been silent for an eternity. He downed the rest of his whiskey in one long, searing swallow. It did not burn. He had caged 2 doves in his fortress of grief, but as the wind howled outside a low, mournful sound, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one who was truly trapped. He listened to their faint footsteps recede down the hall, the sound swallowed by the immense, hungry silence of the house. He was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. It was alive with the ghost he'd just invited in, alive with the breathing of a child in a room that had been silent for an eternity. He downed the rest of his whiskey in one long, searing swallow. It did not burn. He had caged 2 doves in his fortress of grief. But as the wind howled outside a low, mournful sound, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one who was truly trapped. Hours bled into one another, measured by the slow march of shadows across the floor. The fire died down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers offering no warmth, only a faint blood-red light. Caleb did not move from his chair. He had tried to drink more, but the whiskey tasted like poison on his tongue. Useless. It couldn't drown the sounds that now haunted his house, the soft creak of floorboards from a room down the hall, the whisper of a woman trying to soothe a restless child, the faint, ragged echo of a cough. Every sound was an accusation. He knew what the arrangement demanded. He had set the terms with the brutal clarity of a hangman's noose. Now it was time to collect his payment. The thought was cold, mechanical, the way it was supposed to be. He rose from the chair, his body stiff. The predator in him knew the path. It was a short walk. He walked down the long, shadowed hallway, each creaking floorboard a note in a funeral dirge for the man he used to be, or perhaps for the monster he was trying to become. Moonlight sliced through a high window, painting a silver scar across the floor. To his right was the child's room, silent now. To his left, hers. Her room was a cell of terrified silence. He knew she was in there awake, listening to his approach. Waiting. He reached her door. His hand rose, his knuckles brushing against the cold, rough sawn wood. He could feel her fear through the door, a palpable thing, a scent in the air like ozone before a lightning strike. This was his right. This was the bargain. He had only to turn the knob. He stopped. A sound. From the other room. It was a small, fretful whimper, followed by another one of those dry, brittle coughs. The sound was a key, turning a lock deep inside him, a lock rusted shut by years of rage and grief. It opened a door he never wanted to walk through again. The predator in him froze, and the father, the ghost of a father, screamed. He saw not a stranger's child, but his own little Sarah, her face pale with fever in the final days, her breathing a fragile, failing rhythm. His hand fell from the door. The cold resolve shattered into 1,000 pieces of raw, agonizing memory. He couldn't do it. He couldn't take the mother while the child suffered a pale echo of the ghost that owned his soul. With a curse that was half a sob, he turned and stalked back toward the main room, his heavy tread now a frantic retreat. He snatched a thick wool blanket from a chest by the hearth, one of his wife's, a scent of dried lavender still clinging to it like a memory, and strode back down the hall. He didn't go to Lydia's door. He went to the child's. He knocked a sharp, angry rap. Seconds later, Lydia's door creaked open. She stood in the sliver of light from her own lamp, wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale and braced for the inevitable. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it made his gut clench. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He stared at the closed door of the child's room. The cough, he growled the word torn from him. I heard it. Lydia flinched, confusion warring with her fear. She has a chill. It's the journey. He thrust the blanket at her, not a gift, but a command. Another one. The nights here are colder than you know. He wasn't just talking about the weather. He met her gaze for a single fleeting second, and he saw not a whore he had purchased, but a woman standing on the edge of a precipice staring down at him. Then he turned and walked away, the sound of his own boots a thunder in the silent hall. He did not look back. He retreated to his own wing of the house, to a bedroom that was as cold and empty as a tomb. He threw himself onto the bed without removing his boots, the silence pressing in heavier than before. The house was no longer just occupied. It was judging him. He had demanded her body, but it was his own soul that was now laid bare. The bargain was set, the payment was due. And he, Caleb Thorne, was the one who couldn't pay. He retreated to his own wing of the house, to a bedroom that was as cold and empty as a tomb. He threw himself onto the bed without removing his boots, the silence pressing in heavier than before. The house was no longer just occupied. It was judging him. He had demanded her body, but it was his own soul that was now laid bare. The bargain was set, the payment was due. And he, Caleb Thorne, was the one who couldn't pay. The dawn broke thin and bruised over the jagged peaks of the mountains, spilling a weak gray light into his room. Sleep had not come. It had been a long, raw night spent wrestling with ghosts he thought he had buried years ago under miles of trail dust and barrels of whiskey. His failure in the hallway was a fresh wound, a glaring sign of weakness he could not afford not in front of her. He needed to reassert the rules. His rules. He swung his legs off the bed, the floorboards cold against his worn boots. The house was still, but it was a different stillness now. It was the quiet of held breath. He moved through the great room, the embers in the hearth now a pile of pale, dead ash. He expected to find her hiding in her room, a prisoner waiting for her jailer's next command. He found her in the kitchen. It was a place he hadn't set foot in for years, a domain of dust and the silent, disapproving memory of his wife's laughter. But now, a fire was crackling in the great iron stove. A pot of water was steaming, and Lydia Monroe was standing at a heavy wooden counter, her back to him, methodically kneading a small, pathetic lump of dough from the meager flour she must have found in the pantry. She was not cowering. She was working. She was creating an island of purpose in his sea of decay. The sight of it, the sheer domesticity, was a violation. It was an act of defiance more profound than any scream or plea. "I do not recall that being part of our arrangement," he said. His voice was a rasp, loud in the quiet room. She stiffened, but did not turn around for a long moment. When she finally did, her face was pale, but composed. The terror from last night was gone, replaced by a weary, watchful resolve. "The girl needs nourishment, Mr. Thorne. I found flour. I thought it better to earn our keep than to simply take." Earn. The word was a slap. She was trying to rewrite the terms of their sordid contract to claw back a piece of her dignity. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over her, ready to remind her exactly what her keep cost. "Last night was a reprieve," he snarled, moving closer. "Not a pardon. Do not mistake." A small voice cut through his threat like a shard of glass. Mama, the little girl, Rose, stood in the doorway, clutching a small, crudely carved wooden horse. She looked impossibly small in the vast, shadowed kitchen, her eyes wide and curious, fixed on him. They were not his Sarah's eyes, he told himself. They were not. But they held the same devastating innocence. She took a hesitant step toward him, her gaze dropping to his dusty, worn boots. "You're the man with the sad horse," she stated, her voice clear and unafraid. Caleb froze. The anger, the need for control, it all evaporated, leaving him utterly exposed. He could face down a charging outlaw, a coiled rattler, a winter storm, but this was an assault of innocence he was not armed to repel. He misses his mama. The girl continued, looking up at him now, her head tilted. All the horses get sad when they miss their mamas. And in the space of a heartbeat, Caleb Thorne was not a monster in his own home. He was a target pierced by the simple, unwavering truth of a child. He saw Lydia watching them, her expression unreadable. He saw that she saw at the crack, the wound, the raw, unguarded pain on his face. Her witnessing it felt like a brand on his skin. He couldn't breathe. The kitchen walls were closing in the air, thick with the ghosts of his wife's cooking, his daughter's laughter, and this new, unbearable reality. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode from the room. He grabbed his hat and coat from the hook by the door and stormed out into the biting morning wind, not stopping until he was at the stables. He saddled his horse, a powerful black stallion with rough, angry movements. He had to ride. He had to feel the wind tear at his face, feel the burn in his lungs, feel the familiar punishment of the land. He spurred the horse riding hard into the wind, seeking the horizon. But the ranch house loomed behind him, a tomb suddenly horribly filled with life. He could master 1,000 acres of unforgiving country, could break the wildest horse. But he was beginning to suspect the quiet woman and her ghost-eyed child might just be the one thing that could truly break him. He spurred his horse riding hard into the wind, seeking the familiar punishment of the land. But the ranch house loomed behind him, a tomb, suddenly horribly filled with life. He could master 1,000 acres of unforgiving country, could break the wildest horse. But he was beginning to suspect the quiet woman and her ghost-eyed child might just be the one thing that could truly break him. He rode until the sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, until the stallion's flanks were dark with sweat and his own lungs burned with the thin, dry air. He rode through canyons carved like scars into the earth and across plains so vast and empty they seemed to mock the very idea of a man's existence. This was his sanctuary. Here there were no ghosts with his daughter's eyes, no quiet women whose silence screamed louder than any accusation. There was only the wind, the rock, and the fight for survival. But the escape was a fiction. Her face, pale and composed in his kitchen, was branded onto his mind. The child's innocent question echoed on the wind. He was a man running from a house that was no longer empty, and the further he rode, the more it seemed to pull him back. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, he finally turned the stallion for home. The ride back was a slow, grudging surrender. He saw the faint yellow lamplight of the ranch house from a mile out, a single defiant spark in the encroaching darkness. It was no longer the dark, sleeping monolith he was used to. It was awake. It was waiting. He dismounted at the stable, the weariness in his bones profound. He did not go to the house. Not yet. He couldn't face the quiet judgment within its walls. Instead, his eyes fell upon the far corral, the one built with thick, reinforced timbers. Inside, a shadow moved, a restless, violent energy. Demon. That's what the ranch hands called the wild mustang they'd brought in a week ago, a creature of pure, untamable fury that had already crippled one man. Here, finally, was a battle he knew how to win. He strode into the corral, closing the heavy gate behind him. The air was electric with the horse's fear and aggression. It was a magnificent beast, midnight black, its eyes rolling white in the fading light. This was a language Caleb understood: brute force against a wild spirit. He would pour all the frustration, all the grief, all the raw, unnamed rage that was churning inside him into this one singular act of dominance. He would break this horse, and in doing so he would piece himself back together. He worked the stallion in a maelstrom of dust and fury, the world shrinking to the sweat-soaked leather of the reins, the violent heave of the animal's lungs, and the burning fire in his own. The horse bucked it, kicked it, screamed, a raw, desperate cry for freedom. But Caleb held on his own will, a thing of iron. He did not break. He would not. This was his church. This was his confession. After what felt like an eternity, the horse's fight began to ebb, its violent thrashing replaced by trembling exhaustion. Finally it stood, head-bowed sides heaving, its magnificent spirit bent to his will. He had won. He slid from its back, his own body aching and bruised, but filled with a savage, empty triumph. He stood there, chest heaving the victor. It was then he sensed it. A presence. He looked up. Standing by the fence, partially cloaked in the shadows of the stable, were Lydia and Rose. They hadn't made a sound. How long had they been watching? He saw the child's wide, awestruck eyes. But it was Lydia's face that held him captive. He had expected to see fear, or perhaps even admiration for his strength. He was prepared for that. He was not prepared for pity. Her gaze was not on him, the conqueror. It was on the defeated horse, its head low, its spirit dimmed. Her expression was one of profound, aching sorrow. "It is a magnificent spirit," she said, her voice soft, carrying across the dusty corral. It wasn't an accusation. It was a lament. He stood alone in the center of the corral, the master of a broken beast, his victory tasting like ash in his mouth. She took her daughter's hand and turned back toward the house, but paused, looking at him one last time over her shoulder. Must everything be broken? She asked her quiet words, a more damning judgment than any court could deliver. Before you will let it be near you. He had no answer. He watched her go, a ghost returning to his haunted house. He had broken the horse. But as he looked at his own trembling, empty hands, he wondered for the first time, what exactly had she just broken in him? He had no answer. He watched her go, a ghost returning to his haunted house. He had broken the horse. But as he looked at his own trembling, empty hands, he wondered for the first time, what exactly had she just broken in him? He stayed in the corral until the last of the light had been devoured by the horizon and the sky was a bruised, starless canopy. A new chill was in the air, a damp, biting cold that had nothing to do with the coming night. It carried the scent of iron and far-off ice. He felt it in his bones, a primal warning. A storm was coming, a bad one, an early blizzard descending from the high peaks like a hungry wolf. He tended to the horses, his movements slow, mechanical. Her question echoed with every scrape of the currycomb, every forkful of hay. Must everything be broken? He went back to the house, not as a master, but as a man seeking shelter, the same as any other creature on his land. The house was warm. A fire roared in the hearth, a stark contrast to the dead embers of the morning. A pot of stew simmered over the kitchen stove, its rich scent filling the rooms, a scent he hadn't smelled in this house since before. He saw Lydia ushering Rose to her room, her movements quick, her face etched with a new kind of worry, this one for the coming storm. He was a ghost in his own home, watching life happen around him, a life he had orchestrated but had no part in. By midnight the storm hit. It was not a gentle snowfall. It was a physical assault, a screaming maelstrom of wind and ice that hammered against the sturdy timbers of the house. The world vanished into a churning vortex of white. The ranch was no longer a fortress. It was an island isolated from the rest of the world, adrift in a frozen sea. Inside, the three of them were trapped, the silence between them now amplified by the howling fury outside. Caleb sat by the fire, a rifle across his lap, listening to the house groan under the strain. He was listening for a different sound, too, a sound he had been dreading since morning. It came near dawn. A weak, fretful cry from Rose's room, followed by the familiar, terrifyingly dry cough. This was the ghost he could not outrun, the memory he could not break. It had come for him at last. He found himself on his feet, moving down the hallway without conscious thought. He pushed open the door to the child's room. Lydia was there, kneeling by the small bed, bathing the girl's face with a damp cloth. The air was thick with the scent of fever. Rose was shivering violently under a mountain of blankets, her cheeks flushed a dangerous red, her breathing shallow. Lydia looked up as he entered, her eyes wide, not with fear of him, but with the universal terror of a mother watching her child slip away. The bargain, the anger, the pride, it all dissolved in the face of this shared primal enemy. "Her fever is back," Lydia whispered, her voice raw. Worse than before. He saw the helplessness in her posture, the same helplessness that had hollowed him out years ago. He was not in his own house in the year 1885. He was in another room in another lifetime, and he was failing all over again. "The blankets," he said, his voice rough, taking command not as a master but as a veteran of this specific hellish war. "They're trapping the heat. Take them off. All but one." He moved to the window, peering out into the white abyss. Snow. "We need to pack snow in cloths to bring the fever down." He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled on his coat and plunged out into the blizzard, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs. He scooped armfuls of clean-biting snow, the cold a welcome penance on his raw hands. When he returned, Lydia was staring at him, her expression a mixture of desperation and awe. You know what to do," she said, her voice barely audible over the screaming wind. He didn't answer immediately. He knelt on the other side of the bed, packing the snow into a spare cloth. His movements efficient, practiced a terrible muscle memory he prayed he'd never have to use again. He gently placed the cold compress on the child's forehead. Rose whimpered, but didn't pull away. He looked across the small feverish body at the woman whose life he had tried to ruin. He saw the faint lamplight reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. The truth, a raw and ragged thing, was clawed from the depths of him. "I've sat this vigil before," he said, his voice a broken whisper. He stared at the child's flushed face, but he saw another. Her name was Sarah. He felt Lydia's gaze on him, but he couldn't look at her. The fever. It was the same. He swallowed the words like swallowing shards of glass. It won. The confession hung in the small, warm room, a wound laid open. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with a universe of shared, unspoken grief. Then he felt it, a small, warm pressure on his forearm. He looked down. Lydia's hand was resting there, her fingers light, a gesture not of pity, but of profound human understanding. It was the first time a woman had touched him in kindness and shared sorrow since his wife's death. The contact was a shock, a jolt that seemed to travel straight to his frozen heart. The blizzard howled like a hungry wolf outside the window, its rage a pale imitation of the storm raging within him. And as Caleb looked at the woman beside him, her hand a small warm anchor on his arm, he realized he was no longer fighting the ghosts of his past. He was fighting for this child's future. And for the first time he was terrified he might lose all over again. The blizzard howled like a hungry wolf outside the window, its rage a pale imitation of the storm raging within him. And as Caleb looked at the woman beside him, her hand a small warm anchor on his arm, he realized he was no longer fighting the ghosts of his past. He was fighting for this child's future. And for the first time he was terrified he might lose all over again. The night became a timeless, desperate vigil. They moved in a silent, synchronized rhythm born of shared desperation, two ghosts battling a third for the soul of a child while the world outside tried to tear itself apart. He fetched snow. She bathed the girl's burning skin. He held Rose's small hand, whispering words of encouragement not to her, but to the memory of his own daughter, a desperate prayer sent back through time. Lydia's presence beside him was a steady, quiet strength, her resilience a thing of awesome, terrifying beauty. He saw in her the same unbreakable will that had been in his own wife, a will that had fought until the very end. The hours stretched thin and taut. The lamp burned low, the oil almost gone. The wind's fury began to subside, its scream softening to a low, mournful moan. And in the deep, exhausted silence of the room, as the first hint of a pale, bruised dawn appeared at the edge of the window, A change occurred. A single deep breath from the small form on the bed. Then another. A fine sheen of sweat broke on Rose's forehead. The violent shivering ceased, replaced by the profound stillness of a deep, healing sleep. The fever had broken. The ghost had retreated. Caleb felt the tension drain out of him in a single, shuddering wave. It was a release so profound it felt like a part of his own soul, frozen for years, had finally begun to thaw. He looked at Lydia. Her face was illuminated by the coming dawn, streaked with tears that now fell in silent, grateful streams. He saw not the woman he had tried to break, but the woman who had, in the crucible of this long, dark night, unwittingly saved him. He stayed until the sun was fully risen, watching the child sleep before retreating to the great room, his heart a raw, aching thing in his chest. The storm had passed. The world outside was a silent miracle reborn in white and dazzling sunlight. Every harsh line of the landscape softened, forgiven. He stoked the fire, the simple domestic act feeling foreign and yet deeply right. A short time later, Lydia appeared in the doorway, her face weary but her eyes clear. They stood in the quiet of the morning, the ugly bargain a phantom between them. He knew with absolute certainty that it had to be slain. He gestured to the chair opposite his. Lydia. It was the first time he had said her name. It felt both strange and natural on his tongue. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. He struggled for the words, a man more comfortable with the cold language of command than the fumbling tongue of confession. The arrangement we made. He began, his voice rough. It was the bargain of a broken man. A cruel one. There is no excuse for it. He finally looked at her, his gaze stripped of all its former hardness. It is null. You and the girl. You have a home here. For as long as you need it. There is no debt. There is no price. She watched him, her expression soft. You were a man hiding in a fortress, Mr. Thorne. I think the storm finally broke down the walls. Caleb, he corrected her, the name a plea. My name is Caleb. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the clean white world. This house, it was a tomb. For years, I filled it with ghosts and silence because I was too much of a coward to live. You and Rose, you brought life back into it. He turned back to her, his heart hammering against his ribs, a different kind of fear and a fragile, terrifying hope rising in him. I'm not asking you to honor our bargain, Lydia. I am asking you to help me make a new one. He took a breath, laying his soul bare. I'm asking if you would be willing to share my life. Not just my roof or my name, but my life. The broken parts and whatever is left to mend. I am asking you to let me be a father to your daughter and a husband to you. He saw the shock in her eyes, the disbelief. He held up a hand, needing her to know the truth of it. If the answer is no, my promise stands. A home and my protection. Always. The choice is yours. Freely given. Lydia rose and walked to him, stopping just before him. She looked up into his face, searching his eyes, and what she saw there must have been enough. A small, beautiful smile touched her lips. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Caleb. Just then a small, clear voice called from the hallway. Mama. They turned together as Rose appeared, her cheeks pale, but no longer flushed, her eyes clear and bright. She ran to Lydia, who scooped her into a hug before looking over at Caleb, a shy smile on her face. Caleb knelt so he was on her level. For the first time, he didn't see the ghost of the daughter he had lost. He saw the beautiful living child he had just been given the chance to gain. He reached out a hand, not to command or to take, but to offer. And as the little girl's small fingers curled around his, the last of the ice around Caleb Thorne's heart finally, truly melted away. In the quiet of the morning, in a house reborn, a family began.